Look who just got validation from the most unexpected source. Yeah, pause there for a second. Feel that shift in your chest. Not excitement, not relief. Something quieter, heavier. Something that settles instead of explodes, because this wasn't the kind of validation that comes with applause or public praise. This wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It didn't even try to comfort you. It simply arrived after all that time. After the silence. After the isolation. After watching your story get bent, simplified, retold by people who never bothered to ask you what actually happened. You stood still while the room rewrote you. You let them. Not because you agreed, but because you knew something they didn't. You knew that chasing belief turns truth into performance, and you refused to perform. You didn't beg to be understood. You didn't force your version into conversations that were already poisoned. You didn't plead your case to people who had already decided who they needed you to be in order to feel comfortable with themselves. You went quiet, not empty, not defeated. Quiet like someone who knows the difference between noise and power, and they mistook that silence for weakness. They filled it with assumptions. They filled it with doubt. They filled it with a version of you that made their choices easier to live with. Because if you were wrong, if you were unstable, if you were too much, then they didn't have to look at what they'd done. They didn't have to question the story they'd invested in. They didn't have to carry responsibility. So doubt spread. Not because it was true, but because it was convenient. Because it bonded people together. Because it made them feel safe on the same side. And you watched it happen. You watched how quickly certainty forms when no one wants to ask real questions. You watched how silence gets interpreted by people who are afraid of complexity. You watched how group agreement slowly replaces thinking. And still, you didn't interrupt it. You stayed grounded in your own memory, in your own perception, in the quiet, unshakable knowing of what you lived and what you didn't. You didn't need the crowd to confirm reality for you. You didn't need consensus to validate your experience. That's what they never understood. You weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you knew saying it wouldn't change who they were ready to listen to. So you stepped back. You healed where no one was watching. You rebuilt without witnesses. You processed the confusion, the self-doubt they tried to plant. The nights where even you wondered if holding your tongue was costing you something you'd never get back. And then something happened. Not because you pushed, not because you demanded, not because you defended yourself one last time with better words, but because someone outside the echo chamber paused. Someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the story. Someone who didn't need you to be wrong in order to feel right. Someone who didn't benefit from maintaining the narrative as it was. A presence. An authority not defined by titles, but by discernment, by distance, by the ability to look at patterns instead of personalities. They didn't come in loudly. They didn't accuse. They didn't announce a verdict. They simply asked a question. A real one that didn't fit neatly into the version everyone had memorized. And that question did more damage to the false consensus than any defense you could have given, because suddenly the story hesitated. You know that moment. That's brief, not comfortable pause, when a room realizes it might have been wrong, but hasn't decided yet what to do with that realization. When certainty cracks, just enough for light to get in. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like gravity shifting, because when someone like that questions a narrative, it doesn't just validate you. It destabilizes everyone who relied on that narrative to stay comfortable. Now the story they told each other has weight again. Now timelines don't line up the way they used to. Now certainty feels forced. Now silence doesn't look like guilt anymore. It looks like restraint, and they feel it. You may never hear the conversations happening now, but you don't need to. You can sense the recalibration, the sudden caution, the way people who were once confident in their judgment start speaking more carefully, the way statements turn into qualifiers, the way certainty becomes conditional, because something terrifying has happened for them. Doubt has become acceptable, and once doubt enters a closed system, everything inside it starts to wobble. They're not panicking because you were validated. They're panicking because they were never as certain as they pretended to be. They weren't protecting truth. They were protecting alignment. They weren't standing on principle. They were standing where it was safest to stand. And now that safety is gone, now they have to sit with questions they avoided. Now they have to reckon with the possibility that silence didn't mean weakness, that calm didn't mean guilt, that walking away didn't mean you had nothing to stand on. Now they have to face the uncomfortable truth that the story only worked as long as no one credible slowed it down. And here's the part they don't want to admit, even to themselves. This validation didn't come because you waited long enough. It came because you didn't chase it. It came because truth doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to consistency, to alignment, to someone staying rooted while the noise exhausts itself. You didn't collapse under the weight of being misunderstood. You didn't become bitter. You didn't turn your healing into a performance designed to win sympathy. You let time do what it always does when truth is left alone. It exposed the weak joints. No, people are remembering things differently, revisiting moments they brushed past, replaying conversations with new ears. And some of them are realizing they never actually looked closely. They just followed the tone of the room. That realization is dangerous, because once someone sees how easily they participated in distortion, they can't unsee it. And not everyone will be brave enough to sit with that discomfort. Some will double down internally, even if they soften outwardly. Some will quietly distance themselves from the story altogether. Some will begin revising their role in it, telling themselves they were never fully convinced. And some may come back toward you, cautiously, carefully testing whether acknowledgement is now safe. But this part matters. This moment isn't about who comes back. It's about who you let close now that the noise has shifted. Because validation changes things, even when you didn't ask for it. It reveals motives. It exposes timing. It shows who needed permission to think clearly. And you're not the same person who first went quiet. You're steadier now, less interested in being understood by everyone, more precise about who gets access to your inner world. You've seen how quickly truth becomes negotiable when it threatens belonging. You've learned that some people don't need evidence to believe lies. They need comfort. And you've learned that being right doesn't feel the way you imagined it would. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like clarity settling in your bones. Because even now, with the narrative cracking, you're not standing up to announce anything. You're not demanding apologies. You're not reclaiming space loudly. You're watching how people move when belief becomes inconvenient. Watching who asks better questions, watching who stays quiet for the right reasons, and who stays quiet because they're afraid. This isn't the end of the story. This is the moment before the real separation happens, where truth doesn't shout, but waits, where validation doesn't rescue, but reveals, where silence stops being misread and starts being understood. And as the room continues to adjust, as more people feel the discomfort of that first honest question, you remain exactly where you've been all along. Grounded, clear, unrushed, because you were never waiting to be proven right. You were waiting for the noise to collapse under its own weight, and it just started. And now you're standing in the aftermath of that first crack, not the dramatic kind people fantasize about, not explosions, not public reversals. This is quieter than that, more unsettling, because once a narrative starts to fracture, It doesn't shatter all at once. It splinters slowly, invisibly, in ways only the attentive can feel. You can feel it. The energy around you is different now. Not warmer, not friendlier, just cautious. People are measuring their words again, watching your reactions more closely, replaying old assumptions in their heads with a discomfort they don't know how to name, because something fundamental shifted when that unexpected voice paused the story instead of repeating it. For the first time, doubt didn't come from the margins. It came from the center, and that terrifies people who built their certainty on numbers instead of truth. You see, group narratives are fragile things. They don't survive scrutiny. They survive agreement. As long as enough people nod along, the story feels solid. It feels safe. It feels unquestionable. But the moment someone respected refuses to nod, refuses to accept the version they were handed, the spell breaks, and now everyone has to decide who they actually are. This is the part no one talks about. The part after validation, when the spotlight doesn't swing toward you, but inward toward everyone else. Because when truth resurfaces without being chased, it doesn't just clear one name, it exposes a system. People are asking themselves questions they avoided before. Why was I so quick to believe that? Why did I never ask them directly? Why did silence make me uncomfortable enough to assume the worst? And some of them don't like the answers, because the answers point to convenience, to fear of standing alone, to the quiet calculation that it was easier to align with the louder side than to risk being wrong with integrity. They're realizing that your silence wasn't empty. It was disciplined, that your distance wasn't avoidance. It was containment, that your refusal to fight for belief wasn't weakness. It was self-trust. And self-trust is deeply threatening to people who outsource their judgment. You didn't need the crowd to hold your reality together. You didn't need consensus to stay sane. While they were reinforcing each other's certainty, you were reinforcing yourself. That difference matters now more than ever. Because when narratives collapse, people look for somewhere to stand. Some will look toward you not to apologize, but to anchor themselves. To relieve the discomfort of realizing they might have played a role in something unfair. They'll want reassurance that they're still good people, that their intentions were pure, that their silence or participation didn't mean what it now appears to mean. And this is where your evolution shows. You don't rush to comfort them. You don't rush to explain yourself again. You don't rush to reopen wounds just to make them feel better about having ignored them. You understand something now that you didn't before. Understanding doesn't require re-entry. You're allowed to remain composed without becoming available. You're allowed to acknowledge truth without restoring access. You're allowed to accept validation without rewriting history for the comfort of those who waited until it was safe to question. That unexpected confirmation didn't obligate you to anyone. It liberated you from the need to prove what you already knew. And some people can feel that boundary hardening. They sense that the version of you who would over-explain, who would bend to be believed, who would soften truth to keep peace, is gone. That version didn't survive the silence. What emerged instead is someone far less reactive, far less eager to be understood by everyone. Someone who knows that clarity doesn't need witnesses to exist. That's what unsettles them, because they can no longer pull you back into the old dynamic. They can no longer frame you as defensive or unstable or emotional for holding your ground. You're not arguing. You're not correcting. You're not chasing closure. You're watching the room adjust without you. And here's the thing they don't realize yet. This isn't the end of their discomfort. It's the beginning. Because once a story cracks, it invites examination elsewhere. People start noticing patterns, start rethinking other moments they accepted without question. Start wondering how often they've mistaken confidence for truth and silence for guilt. Your situation becomes a reference point, not spoken aloud, but felt. A quiet example of what happens when someone refuses to collapse under misrepresentation, and that makes some people deeply uneasy, because it suggests a larger possibility that maybe the world they trust is less reliable than they believed, that maybe certainty is often borrowed, not earned, that maybe being loud isn't the same as being right. Not everyone is ready to sit with that. Some will retreat further into defensiveness. Some will become colder, more distant, pretending the question never happened. Some will subtly shift their stance without acknowledging why, hoping no one notices the change. And a few, only a few, will genuinely reflect. Those are the ones who grow. But growth doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes growth just means honesty. You're not waiting for apologies anymore. You're not measuring who comes back. You're not tallying who was wrong. You've moved past the need for the story to resolve cleanly. You've learned that resolution is a luxury truth doesn't always offer. What it offers, instead, is alignment. And alignment feels like this: calm, clear, unrushed. You don't feel the urge to announce your vindication. You don't feel the need to correct every misinterpretation. You don't feel triumphant. You feel steady, because validation didn't give you something new. It simply confirmed what you protected all along. Your memory, your perception, your internal compass. And now, when people look at you differently, you notice something else. They quieter around you, not because you're intimidating, but because you're no longer malleable. They can't shape you with opinion anymore. They can't pull you into emotional labor. They can't rewrite you in real time. You've become harder to project onto, and projection needs participation. The unexpected validation didn't raise your voice, it lowered the room. It introduced a pause where there used to be certainty, a hesitation where there used to be confidence. And in that pause, people are forced to hear their own thoughts instead of the chorus. Some of them don't like what they hear. They'll try to move past it quickly, to normalize again, to pretend the moment never mattered, but moments like that don't disappear. They lodge themselves in memory. They resurface when similar situations arise. They whisper, "Remember when we were wrong before," and that whisper changes behavior. You may never see the full ripple, but you'll feel it in subtler ways. In the way people ask more careful questions, in the way stories are told with less certainty, in the way silence is treated with a little more respect. Your experience recalibrated something, not because you fought for it, but because you endured without surrendering yourself. And now, as you stand here, you're aware of something that used to feel out of reach. You don't need to be believed to be whole. You don't need consensus to be sane. You don't need validation to move forward. It arrived anyway on its own terms, from a place you never chased. And that's the part that stays with you. Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs integrity. You had that long before anyone confirmed it. So as the room continues to adjust, as narratives soften and certainty erodes, you don't step forward to claim your place. You already occupy it, quietly, firmly, without explanation. And the most unsettling thing for everyone else, you're not waiting for the story to end. You're already living beyond it.